What I want to talk about today is a series of problems, and what I'm going to do is divide my time into three bits. The first bit is going to give a general sense of where these problems come from, and I'm going to try to convince you that there is a set of issues that are worth talking about. And then I'm going to talk about two specific examples, two ways in which these problems arise in contemporary society. And then tomorrow I'm going to take it one step further and go after what I think are the really hard instances of the problem, the really hard-esque instances of the problem. It's all, I'm afraid, going to be a little bit gloomy. I'm going to be emphasizing challenges for us. And although I'll propose some tentative solutions, the solutions are far more tentative than the diagnosis. So let me begin with two features of the world today. Where I live, in the United States, a sort of more backward part of North America, there are really two polar positions. There are people in my country who think that science has had far too little impact on people's lives and on public policies. They point to examples like evolution, to biotechnology, and climate change. On the other hand, there are people who think that science has had far too much impact on people's beliefs and public policies, and that science tends to override the natural wisdom of ordinary people. And they too point to examples like evolution, biotechnology, climate change. Now, I want to approach the issue of how science should actually fit within a democratic society. So I'm going to begin at the very beginning. Let's go back to a classic source of the idea that societies work best when there are wise people leading the show. Plato. So Plato really builds his utopia in the Republic on the idea that people's lives are going to go well if they're directed by extremely wise and especially well-educated people who will be preserved from corruption at the high point of their education in this form of good. Now, Plato realizes that the friends of democracy are not going to like this very much, and are going to point out that this gets in the way of human freedom. But he thinks that real freedom consists in the opportunity to express your talents and thus to live well. He thinks, I think, that freedom of choice in figuring out what you want to be and what you want to do with your life isn't really essential to living well. Now, democracy, it seems to me, argues in direct opposition to that. Even if all of us set up our lives in a botched and bad way, it's better that we should do it ourselves authentically, making our own mistakes. But one might think that even if people choose their own projects for themselves, work out what they want their lives and themselves to be, it's a good idea if there's a division of epistemic labor. We don't want to think of ourselves as all beginning from the beginning. We want to think of ourselves as relying on one another and learning from one another and perhaps having a pool of common knowledge. And thus arises the question, which is at the heart of what I want to do. How do you put epistemic authority together with democratic values? Now, there is a simple proposal about this, and it's been extremely popular, and it relies on just the distinction that Joe pointed out was flawed in his opening remarks. Scientific research, we might say, gives us the facts, just the facts, right? And people outside science then supply the values in their own possibly idiosyncratic ways. Now, this conception has been undermined within philosophy. It was undermined very famously in a debate that occurred in the 1950s, in which Richard Rotman, once an editor of Philosophy of Science, participated. And it has been reiterated ever since, down to a very recent book by the philosopher Heather Douglas. But already in the 1920s, John Dewey, my hero, saw that this was flawed. He pointed out that scientific research is permeated by judgments about values. They're deeply embedded in the daily practice of science. they can't be, as it were, filtered out and extruded at the end. The values cannot simply be tacked on, but they are embedded in the very practice of science itself. Now, that's a worrying thing, because much of our discourse about science depends on assuming a value-free ideal, and that ideal is attractive in part because of widespread suspicion. The suspicion is that once you start talking about value, all standards disappear. There is no basis on which people can be brought to any kind of agreement. Nothing serious and sensible can be said. That seems to me a dangerous mistake.
I'll be back, but...
And so I'm going to give you a very, very brief conception for how we might think about that. I'll keep looking over my shoulder to make sure that I've got the right thing up there to go with what I want to say. So here it is. It's a democratic conception. I believe that the human practice of value is part of a social technology that is absolutely central to our species' life, that human beings have been practicing for tens of thousands of years. We work out together how to live together, and out of that come our values and our norms. It happened long ago when we lived in groups far smaller than the group of people gathered in this room. And it has evolved and flowered in all sorts of interesting ways over tens of thousands of years. And it's sometimes been distorted by the assumption that there are special people who have special expertise, either religious or philosophical in this class. There are no experts, there's just us, and we have to work together. And if philosophy can do anything in all of this, it's to play a facilitating role. That's the way I think about values. They arise from a certain kind of conversation. And that conversation should be, as it was, I think, in the beginning, deeply democratic. Now, I'm going to begin with a notion of democracy that involves an enrichment of the ways in which we often think about democracy. When democracy is declared and we see people emerging from polling booths with ink-stained fingers which they wave in the end. That's a thin sense of democracy. Democracy is present when there are elections with more or less free and open deliberation. But there's a much deeper sense, I think. And here again, I draw on you. The idea that democracy is best expressed in joint action, joint deliberation, and joint discussion. What I'm going to call mutual engagement. The search for solutions when we face collectively problems that are acceptable to all of us. We may not find them, but a true democratic conception is committed to a search for those, a search for the accommodation of different points of view. And that leads me to a three-tier picture of democracy. At the very most fundamental level, here it's at the top, could easily be at the bottom, are ideals of freedom and equality and freedom, expressed in our working together in recognition of one another's individual projects, which we try to foster insofar as they don't get in one another's way. That is promoted by the involvement of citizens in decisions about matters that affect them. And that in turn is realized in what is the most superficial form of democracy, namely the standard machinery of elections, votes, constitutions, and the law. Now, as a matter of fact, if you think about the way democracy works in complex modern societies like the one in which we now are present, and the one slightly south of the border, these are enormously complicated. The citizens can do very little to exercise fine-grained control over the policies that the society pursues. This has been a commonplace in political theory. Robert Dahl has, I think, articulated it with extraordinary relevance. So why is it that democracy seems such a good thing? Why does it get such a good press? If our ability to control the policies that govern our lives is so rough and approximative? Well, the answer is this. That democracy emerges out of a historical process in which there has been one extremely important problem. That problem has been how to keep under control people who might interfere with constitutional or legal provisions that get in the way of various forms of human liberty. I'm going to call it the problem of identifiable oppression. In the ancient world, in the medieval world, it was obvious in societies that were subjected to various forms of tyranny. Democracy is very good at doing that. It's very good at solving, at the thinnest and most superficial level, that problem, recalling leaders who overstep the bounds when they can be identified as doing so. They are not always identifiable as doing so. Witness the decline of the Weimar Republic into the totalitarian Nazi regime. Now, that is a serious and ongoing problem for all democratic states, how to avoid that kind of oppression. But we also face a very different kind of problem that I'm going to call the problem of unidentifiable oppression, which arises from the complexities of the division of labor and the difficulties of seeing the effects of various kinds of individual actions and governmental interventions. They occur in my slides here in the awful schoolroom that the kids on the upper right inhabit, the slums, the Louisiana slums below that, and on the polluted atmosphere that affects all of us. These are problems that interfere with people's projects for their lives, that interfere with joint action. And they are best seen, I think, as impingements upon human liberty that are not readily identified, perhaps not even readily identifiable. Public knowledge plays a central role in illuminating us about the consequences of actions and the places at which our liberties become endangered. And in that public knowledge, science, and I mean science broadly, I mean all of the disciplines pursued with rigor, from art history and anthropology to zoology, right? Not just the natural sciences, but a lot of other disciplines as well. Science is a central part of this, and the natural sciences, of course, are a highly prestigious central part. Now, these are the most reliable sources of knowledge they have. But in terms of the governance of public knowledge and the transmission to people of information they need to pursue their individual projects and to protect their freedom, science has emerged in its present role almost entirely by accident. It didn't start out that way. In the 17th century, a few breakaway groups distinguished themselves from the universities and from the church and set out to investigate nature for their own curiosity's sake. The Royal Society was originally only open to gentlemen, free and unconfined. Tradesmen were to be kept out. These were private interests that were being served. Over the centuries since, those kinds of investigations have evolved in tandem with the evolution of democracy into a system of public knowledge and into a system of democratic government. And that leads me to the problem that I now want to frame. There is no reason to think that the evolution of science as a system of public knowledge should be particularly well designed to cope with the problems of complex democracies which were unenvisageable when the enterprises began, and unenvisageable for much of their evolution too. So my overall aim in the book I'm writing and in these lectures is really to consider the ways in which scientific authority should be integrated with democratic values. What authority should the sciences have? What are the responsibilities of individual scientists? How does contemporary science fall short? I'm going to talk today about two areas of difficulty. But I want, before I do that, to begin with a general diagnosis. Science might be in trouble with democratic values in two quite different ways. One might be that the value judgments that are embedded within the scientific enterprise might be at odds with those that would be made by people choosing democratic. I'm going to give you one example in which I think that's correct. And the second is, even if that's not the case, there can be a failure of public perception. So there may be public suspicion that that is the case. And I'll give you an example, well, it's a range of examples actually in which that occurs. Now, the interactions between science and democratic values occur, I think, in three main contexts. And so I'm now going to superimpose on this taxonomy a different taxonomy. Here are the three main contexts. Science is intended to give to the public information that people need. Significant information, as I'm going to call it. That means it has to address the right questions. When it certifies answers to those questions, it should do so by methods that are reliable. And its conclusions should be accessible and usable by the people it's to serve. And lapses can occur in any of these respects, and on either of the two dimensions I just distinguished. Wrong value judgments coming in with the practice of science, or a perception that wrong value judgments are coming into the practice of science. So this ends then the first part of my talk, and I now want to talk today about two different problems of the form that I've indicated, and suggest some ways of coming to terms with it. So I'm going to go back, first of all, to a position that I suggested in my book in 2001, Science, Truth, and Democracy, to an ideal of well-ordered science. Now, it is, I think, perfectly straightforward that whatever some philosophers may have written down in their guardian moments, the project of science of giving a complete, true story of the world is, if not incoherent, absolutely unattainable. Research is inherently and necessarily selective. Scientists have to decide which questions to pursue. So, in a democratic conception of science, science might be said to be well-ordered if it would accord, if its agenda would accord with the choices that would be made by fully informed people representing a wide variety of perspectives, deliberating democratically with one another, and that means trying to accommodate one another's points of view. Now, the perspective that I took in 2001, when I wrote Science, Truth, and Democracy, was more or less backing into that position. I often find myself in that position. I'm very slow to learn, right? But now it seems to me just incredibly obvious. It seems to be just a simple corollary of thinking about values and thinking about values democratically, that science should be well-ordered in this sense. I mean, put it more precisely. Well-ordered science requires scientists to pursue topics, questions, on a research agenda that would accord with the deliberations of people who represented many different points of view, ideally all points of view, who were committed to working with one another, taking one another's ideas and projects seriously, and wanting to satisfy one another insofar as possible, and freed of misapprehensions that the current state of scientific knowledge could correct. Okay? That's, I think, a conception of well-ordered science from which I'm going to start, and which I'm going to embellish and enrich as we go on. Now, this seems to me to reflect the original character of what I call the ethical project. It opposes the idea that there are elites whose perspectives are privileged and special. It opposes the idea that our beliefs should be enslaved by our own ignorance. And it opposes the simple idea of allowing the majority to pronounce without regard for the views of minorities. So it opposes, I think, three forms of tyranny. But now I want to extend this notion by suggesting that science is currently practiced, and is mostly practiced in a few extremely lucky countries. The notion that I originally had is too weak. So let's ask a question. What population should science be responsive to? What population should be represented? You might take a narrow conception and just look at the citizens of a particular state in which scientific research is done. Or you might take a broader conception and look at the entire human species and our future descendants. Now, how might we defend a narrow conception? An obvious answer. We, in North America, pay for the research. And so the research should be geared towards our individual needs, those who belong to the Society of Canada, or the Society of the United States, or the Society of Britain, or the Society of Japan, or the Society of Germany. Well, why not do it as it was originally done? Cater to the interests of gentlemen, free and unconfined. Or the members of Mensa, the truly intelligent. Or to the tycoons, perhaps who put up disproportionate amounts of money, and will put up large amounts of the scientific research budget, the more that budget is privatized. Why not? To each according to his productivity. Why be democratic at all? And these questions which I raise as forceful preliminaries point to what I think to be the real difficulty with the narrow conception. Namely, that not all nations have resources to respond to the needs of their citizens. And if research in the affluent world does not respond to the interests of the human population more generally, then many people in poor countries are going to find their interests slighted, possibly in favor of the less important, less central interests of people who are more luckily situated. And that seems to be wrong when we reflect that the history of partitioning of resources among the human population is in large part a history of accidents, and in large part also a history of somewhat murky and nefarious deeds. So, I settle for the broad conception. Now, I've offered you an ideal of well-ordered science. And some people think that this is wrong. They think the scientific research agenda would be better left to the community of scientists. They say things like this. Directed research goes badly. I read a book about this thing. Science thrives when people are allowed to follow their hunches. I read a book about Einstein. I've read Paul Valéry, and I know that we enter the future backwards. Science is just intrinsically unpredictable. We can't realize anything like this idea. I think all of this is wrong. First of all, the stuff about directed research and brilliant geniuses is largely anecdotal. It's not the sort of evidence that scientists or anybody else would normally admit as particularly probative. But let's suppose that it was actually right. Then that would be something for a community of democratic deliberators to take seriously. That would itself be an item of information for their deliberations, rather than something that removed them from the deliberation. And think about the last point. If it is indeed true that we cannot predict the future course of research, and I think there's a very good point there, that doesn't mean we give up on it. Think about homely examples. Families can't predict the future course of their children's lives and the ways that those children will grow up, and yet they take steps to plan for their children's education. They try to help their children along towards achieving their goals. The fact that the future is unpredictable doesn't mean that we give up on trying to prepare ourselves for it. It means that as we prepare for it, we recognize the possibilities that our information is sometimes deficient and that we may have to change our course. The same should be true, I think, of well-ordered science. So I actually think that these objections very common objections that I've heard many times to my idea are spurious. And now I want to focus on a particular example and look at a different kind of complaint. You might think that the ideal I've suggested is actually toothless, but it makes no difference if you think about subjecting scientific research to a more democratic process of the sort I've envisaged. Well, it's not toothless. Our biomedical research would look very, very different, I think, if we committed ourselves to the kind of democratic constraints that I've suggested we should. I've given you some data on the slide from the WHO about the distribution of infectious diseases, in this case diarrheal diseases, around the world. A lot of disease toll, especially on children. Now, the research budgets, until very recently, when a few philanthropically minded foundations started to make a difference, and they still haven't made enough of a difference, were heavily oriented in disease resources, not only to the principal diseases of members of African societies, but also to various kinds of enhancement programs, relatively cosmetic things that members of those societies might want. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands, millions of children were dying because of lack of resources poured into diseases like the ones represented on the board. So let me suggest, in line with the democratic suggestion, what I would call the fair share principle. Assume that two scientific problems have equal tractability, that is, equal promise for solution, then diseases should be investigated in proportion to the burden of suffering they cause. That burden might be measured in crude mortality statistics, or it might be measured in more subtle ways. There are alternative measures for this. Now, if that principle were applied, diseases like malaria and various forms of other forms of infection, respiratory diseases, acute diarrhea, and so forth, are underrepresented by a factor of about 100. And if you look at the budget for the National Institutes of Health in the United States and look at tropical diseases, it looks like a rounding error, first of all. And the second thing is that it's largely devoted towards diseases that crop up in regions of the world to which American military forces might be sent. Okay, so the fair share principle is, I believe, something that would reshape the concept, the research agenda of biomedical science. Now, so far, all I've said is, here's an ideal, I've defended the ideal a little bit, and I've done something to say that it isn't toothless. I might stop here and say, I'm a philosopher. I don't consider the ways in which the ideal should be realized, but I don't think that's in the spirit of this center, and I don't think it should be in the spirit anymore of philosophy. So let me say a few tentative things about realizing the ideal. There is, I think, a need for a far more systematic account of the global range of our research. I think we need something I'm going to call an atlas of scientific significance. Something that tells us where we are in various fields of research and the various opportunities that we might have for responding to various human needs. But that has to go hand in hand with a much more detailed understanding of the needs of people in different societies. We might think we know those, but I was once in a session on these sorts of topics with Gordon Conway, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time, who led a team to a region of Africa and said to them, would you like vaccines for your children? We're thinking of trying to develop, we think we can find ways of developing vaccines that could be brought here, vaccines against particular diseases. And they said, well, we'd like to think about it for a day. And then they came back a few days later and they said to Conway and his team, well, that would be a very nice thing, but you know what we really need? We need vaccines for our goats. Because if the goats get sick, everybody dies. This was something that the extremely well-meaning and intelligent researchers who come into this region hadn't anticipated. So we need, I think, a more systematic look at human needs, human projects, and forms of human freedom than we yet have. Now, if you've been to any conferences in hot fields where scientists talk about promise of where they're going, what you see is something like this. The famous Steinberg cartoon, The View from Neuroscience. The really important problem for the next few years is figuring out how to deal with small sets of neurons. That's the principal scientific problem that we face. But then if you moved on, say, to molecular developmental genetics, now the really serious problem is to do in vertebrates what Gisline Volhard did in fruit flies, right? And you get the Steinberg vision in all of these fields. The point of an atlas of scientific significance would be that it would try to sort that out. Now, these two things, taking stock of what the promises of science are in a systematic way, and what the needs of various human groups are in a systematic way, can only be prelude. We need some surrogate of well-ordered sciences to be a serious ideal for that form of ideal deliberation. How can that be? We can't bring the species together and hash out all the possibilities. Well, there are approximations, and indeed, deliberative democrats have started doing experiments on them. So we might think of citizen juries, representative groups, better, broadly representative groups, bringing people from a number of different environments, a number of different countries together. Take them behind the scenes, to give them insight into what's possible, to how their needs might be served. And to have them talk with one another, to have them try to work out together some deliberation that is more fair to everybody than the haphazard work of countries jockeying for their own individual research gains and responding to the needs of their own citizens. The Jefferson Project has started to investigate this, look at how citizen juries might function. And there is recent work by the political theorist James Fish came on this. This is, I think, a promising direction in which to go. So that's the end of my first case. I'm now going to move to a different kind of example. And I'm going to begin by recognizing that what I've done so far is a relatively conservative incorporation of democratic values within science. Some people, including a very famous philosopher, Paul Feyerabend, have wanted more. They have wanted democratic control not just of the questions that are pursued, but of the answers that are accepted. Paul Feyerabend, in this famous and provocative passage from his book Science in a Free Society, I'm echoing that argues that it shouldn't just be the scientists who make up their minds whether, as in his example here, evolution is true. We all should be involved in that decision. I don't think Feyerabend's right about this. And I spent a large part of my academic life worrying about this sort of problem. But I think there's a point behind the overstated argument in this passage. I think we have troubles at the moment in what I'm going to call the context of certification. If we're going to have a useful division of epistemic labor within our society or within our species, then we want the people who find out about various things to certify knowledge on the basis of reliable procedures. We don't want people who know nothing, as it were, coming in and overriding expert judgment. So, reliable procedures are a good thing, but they're not enough. Democratic science should abide with what I'm going to call the Calpurnian principle. Caesar's life should be above suspicion, right? It should be not only fair, but seen to be fair. It should not only be reliable, but understood to be reliable. Now, on what grounds might we doubt the scientific community? We might doubt it in general, or we might doubt it in particular cases. Sometimes we do have reason to doubt what scientists produce. they turn out to have committed fraud. Occasionally, they turn out to have made misjudgments, to have accepted on the basis of inadequate evidence, or to have applied inappropriate standards. But what I think is really worrying in the current context, and here I think about evolution and climate change, which would be two examples that run through what I'm about to say. What's really going on is the fear of the sway of unacknowledged values. The fear that what is occurring is that the judgments to accept various kinds of conclusions, that the Earth has a long history in which different organisms have appeared at different stages, that anthropogenic climate change is real, and even if we do things about it starting right now, we probably won't prevent warming by a couple of degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Those conclusions are based on the incorporation of faulty values that have been unacknowledged, even by a kind of ideology. Now, it would be good if that were not so. It would be good if we were in a situation where scientific community were, as I would put it, ideally transparent. That is, public knowledge, when it's being built up, as Dewey saw, will involve value judgments. But the values that come into play are those that will be recognized and endorsed by people outside, and the standards involved would be recognized and endorsed by people outside. We can't exclude value judgments from the practice of science. The thought is that they should be widely acknowledged as the judgments that would be reached were we collectively to deliberate together. That's what we want. Getting rid of value judgments, the value-free ideal we want to do. But we want the value judgments not to be idiosyncratic or to be biased. We want to be representative of the public. Now, I think in the current situation, there are two ways in which this seems to have gone wrong. There have been, I think, consequential lapses from the perception of ideal transparency. And that comes out in two contexts. There's the evolution context, and I've spelled it in a way to pronounce by its opponents here. And that's based on something I'm going to call a chimeric epistemology. Here, there's a mismatch between what the public, or members of the public, think are the proper ways to certify claims and the ways the scientific community thinks are proper to certify claims. A genuine mismatch in standards. And then there's what I'm going to call the case of opaque value judgments. This occurs in the European context with respect to genetically modified organisms, and in the North American and increasingly in the world context with respect to climate change. Here, there's not necessarily a mismatch between the standards applied within the community and the standards of people outside, but there's a suspicion of a mismatch. So I'm going to deal with these in order and then make some suggestions about how they might be addressed, but I'm afraid that is going to lead to a somewhat pessimistic conclusion. So let's begin with the evolutionary case. In the great scheme of things, it doesn't seem to me an incredible tragedy if children are told in public school that evolution is a theory put forward and that other people have a right of theory. There are much greater tragedies in the role of science in the world today. Climate change is far more important for our future than the teaching of evolutionary theory is. But this is a case of immense symbolic importance, and I'm going to suggest that it's a case that may actually lead to considerable social troubles in other areas as well. Now, the opposition to Darwin is actually misconceived. Darwin is really only the front man for a whole bunch of areas of science that think that the Earth is very, very old and that lots of different organisms have come forward and so on and so forth. But the opponents are immensely confident that something has gone badly wrong in elite biological science in this example. And why? Why are they so confident? Have they looked carefully at the range of evidence that's been put forward in the process of certification and seen it to be, as it were, mistaken and erroneous. But no, they haven't done that. They haven't made any careful examination. Rather, if you look at the way the scientific community is operating, it has built up an increasingly successful set of solutions to a large number of questions about the history of life on Earth, within geology, within parts of physics, and within evolutionary biology itself. The opposition, however, rests on a very, very simple thought. That is that some evidence has been ignored. Scientists should not ignore the evidence. And in the case of evolution, they always ignore the evidence. And the evidence is absolutely overriding, because there is a definitive text which the opponents think tells the truth as they read it about the history of life on our planet, which has been utterly ignored by the community. So however many problems you solve in understanding relationships among organisms, the dating of strata in the Earth's crust, or the rest of it, it just doesn't cut the mustard, because there's a superior source that overrides all of this and shows it to be mistaken. These opponents have what I'm going to call a chimeric epistemology. It's a chimera. I used to say hybrid, then my wife said to me, hybrid has good connotations. Chimera is bad. It's a chimera because there's a set of standards that opponents would use in a lot of contexts. They would expect their doctors to use them. They would certainly use them if they were trying to fix the plumbing, for example. And these are perfectly ordinary, common sense standards of problem solving and explaining that scientists use in increasingly refined, sophisticated ways. But then there's another source, and the source is a scriptural text, read in a particular way. And when these come into conflict, that text supersedes. Now, the trouble is that if you have people in your society, one group of which accepts the scientific common sense standards across the board, and the other group that has a chimeric epistemology, you have really deep and serious problems. Because chimeric epistemologies are actually consequential. They get in the way of things, like stem cell research, for example. And they get in the way of other things, too. They lead 17% of the US population to think that various kinds of attempts to achieve peace in the Middle East are wrong-headed. It's a very bad idea. What you actually want is more turmoil, because turmoil is predicted to precede the end of days, and we want the end of days as quickly as possible. I mean, it seems bizarre, and yet there are a significant number of my fellow citizens who actually accept that. Now, if you think about democracy, the standard conceptions about democratic discussion, they're supposed to be really hard because of disagreements of values. But if you have chimeric epistemologies around, you don't even get to a stage where you can start talking about values, because the facts themselves are in dispute. And where controversies resist compromise, as they do in cases of higher technology, for example, citizens are going to see their fellows not only as making the wrong judgments, but as also irrational, perhaps even crazy. And a democracy in which that happens is in very serious trouble. Now that's one side of this. The other side, I said, was the opacity of value judgments. So there's a very serious and sensible point. Suppose somebody, your doctor, a friend, your boss, gives you some information that really makes a difference to your life. If you believe that information to be true, you have to change a lot of things you're doing. It would be entirely reasonable for you to ask about the status of that information. Is it really true? Is it really well-grounded? Before I start changing my life in fundamental ways, I want to know things like that. That's perfectly reasonable. If the evidential situation is highly complicated, you won't be able to work that out for yourself. You won't even be able to probe the procedures that led to certification. And you may have grounds for thinking that what's gone wrong here is that some sort of bias has crept in. Some awful bias, some ideology, some set of values that you don't share that is now behind this conclusion and is being used to oppress you, to override your projects, to get you to sacrifice what you most want. This is a perfectly reasonable situation to be in, and it arises with respect to many scientific, technical issues. And in particular, it arises with respect to climate change. It's very hard for people who are worried about the effects on their own lives of policies designed to limit global warming to be satisfied that the conclusions have really been reached without the importation of illicit value judgment. There are these tree-hugging, Birkenstock-wearing, latte-sipping, elite scientists who want the public to stop driving SUVs, right? And they have this agenda and all sorts of political values in it. And this is reinforced by the presence of the other example and this sort of alienation that comes from chimeric epistemologies. Now, what on earth can be done about this? The answer, I think, is to extend the democratic ideal I gave you earlier. Democracy requires some sort of involvement of the public. How are we going to get that in this particular case? Well, I think contemporary scientists are extremely handicapped because of the prevalence of the value-free ideal. They have signed on to the thought that science is a value-free enterprise. But there's a different solution, and that is to try to make the value judgments that play a role within the sciences as transparent as possible. And here again, the small groups of people led this on behind the scenes, the citizen juries, I imagine, playing a role in the setting of the scientific research agenda, could mediate between the public and the scientific community. And at the same time, one could do what the book out there, Naomi Oreskes' book, Emergence of Doubt, does so splendidly in a number of cases, namely expose the idiosyncratic value judgments that occur in the conclusions and arguments of people who oppose certain kinds of policy interventions. Now, I go on one. It seems to me that the problem posed by opaque value judgments is much easier to solve in practice than that stemming from the chimeric epistemologies. That's probably a good thing, because the opacity of value judgments is the one that's most dominant in the context of the most urgent problem, the climate change problem. Now, in the case of the chimeric epistemologies, we have to come to terms, I think, with something extremely deep. As I argued in Living with Darwin, which Jane referred, if you applied the scientific standards across the board, there would be serious grounds for thinking that the substantive beliefs about supernatural beings of all the world's religions are false. And that's a terrible blow for people for whom religion is central to their lives. It seems to me that the only serious possibility for shared standards in democratic society today is the set of secular standards prominent in the sciences and in the ordinary reasoning of most people most of the time. But in practice, because of the central role that religion plays in the lives of mankind, and because religion, in my view, cannot simply be dismissed, as some contemporary writers are inclined to dismiss it, because it answers to genuine needs and problems, religion won't disappear. Chimeric epistemologies won't disappear until more is done to address the positive side that goes along with secular humanism. This is a task, I think, of central importance for philosophers today. To develop a compelling account of secular values and the work of secular lives, and to combine that with the sort of fairness and justice which many people who feel the importance of religion in their lives so severely miss, that societies, democratic societies, can make a transition to a worthwhile and rewarding form of secularism. And I'm going to conclude with another reference to Dewey, who in Common Faith wrote, "It is the claim of religions that they effect a generic and enduring change in attitude." I think Dewey was sympathetic to that, but he thought it needed to be understood differently. I should like to turn the statement around and say that whenever this change takes place, there is a definitely religious attitude. It is not a religion that brings it about, but when it occurs, from whatever cause and by whatever means, there is a religious attitude at function. I think Dewey saw a long time ago a potential solution to the difficulties posed for scientific application in society by the prevalence of religion. But it isn't a solution that in North America, especially in the United States, is being yet articulated. And until that solution has been articulated, until we have a serious and convincing secularism, then I think the breakdown of trust in science that goes along with chimeric epistemology, as I call it, will continue. And that means that many people in our societies may have too little access to information they and we collectively urgently need. So I said I would end on a somewhat pessimistic conclusion. Tomorrow I'm going to try to probe some of these issues a little bit further and suggest that the difficulties are even deeper than I've just proposed. But that will do for what is supposed to be, after all, a great celebration.